16-year-old Emma Rodriguez had learned to move like a ghost through the cramped farmhouse she'd called home for 3 years. Her father, Miguel, had remarried when Emma was 13, bringing Janet Walsh into their lives along with her two daughters from a previous marriage. What started as hopeful blended family quickly turned into Emma's personal nightmare after Miguel died in a farming accident just 8 months later. Janet's mask of maternal care dissolved the moment the funeral flowers wilted, revealing a woman consumed by bitterness and resentment toward the stepdaughter who reminded her daily of her late husband's first love. The transformation was gradual but relentless. Emma's belongings mysteriously disappeared or broke. Her school clothes developed mysterious stains that Janet claimed were Emma's own carelessness. The girl's bedroom was reassigned to Janet's eldest daughter, forcing Emma into the basement storage room where dampness seeped through concrete walls and mice scurried between boxes of forgotten Christmas decorations. Janet's justification was always delivered with saccharine sweetness that fooled neighbors and teachers alike. Emma was simply going through a difficult phase, acting out due to grief, and needed firm guidance to become a proper young lady. The verbal abuse escalated alongside the physical neglect. Janet would wake Emma at 5 in the morning with screaming sessions about imagined infractions, dishes supposedly left dirty, homework allegedly incomplete, or simply breathing too loudly during dinner. The woman seemed to take particular pleasure in comparing Emma unfavorably to her own daughters, who watched these performances with smug satisfaction. They had learned quickly that participating in Emma's humiliation earned them privileges and protection from their mother's volatile moods. School became Emma's only refuge, though even there she struggled to concentrate through exhaustion and hunger. The breaking point came on a sweltering July morning when Janet discovered Emma had used the upstairs bathroom instead of the crude outdoor facility she'd been assigned months earlier. The woman's face contorted with rage as she grabbed Emma by the hair and dragged her outside, past the chicken coop, and toward the pig pen where 3 large sows wallowed in mud and filth. Janet's voice carried across the yard as she screamed about ungrateful children who didn't appreciate the roof over their heads, who thought they were too good for the accommodations provided by their generous stepmother. What happened next would haunt Emma for years to come, but it would also become the catalyst for her eventual freedom. Janet forced the girl into the pen, pushing her down into the mud and waste while screaming that this was where Emma belonged with the other dirty animals who didn't know their place. The pigs, startled by the commotion, snorted and moved restlessly around the terrified teenager who tried desperately to shield herself from their massive bodies. Janet stood at the fence, arms crossed, waiting for Emma to beg for forgiveness and promise to be a better, more grateful daughter. Emma pulled herself from the filthy pen with shaking hands, mud and worse things clinging to her clothes and skin. Janet had finally gone inside after 20 minutes of watching, satisfied that her lesson had been delivered effectively. The girl stumbled toward the old hand pump behind the barn, the only place she was allowed to wash herself since being banned from the house's bathroom facilities. The rusty water ran brown at first, then clear and shockingly cold against her skin as she tried to scrub away the humiliation along with the filth. Her stepsisters watched from the kitchen window, giggling and pointing, as Emma attempted to clean herself with harsh lye soap that left her skin raw and burning. Melissa, the older at 15, took particular joy in these spectacles, often providing running commentary for her 13-year-old sister Katie about how pathetic their stepsister looked. They had learned that cruelty toward Emma was rewarded with extra privileges, later bedtimes, and shopping trips to town that Emma was never invited to join. The isolation was perhaps worse than the physical abuse. Emma had been systematically cut off from every support system she might have turned to for help. Janet had poisoned relationships with neighbors by sharing fabricated stories about Emma's supposed behavioral problems, painting herself as a patient saint dealing with an impossible child. Teachers received similar tales about Emma's grief causing her to act out at home, making her poor appearance and exhaustion seem like typical teenage rebellion rather than signs of abuse. Church members, family friends, even Emma's own extended family, received Janet's carefully crafted narrative about the troubled girl who was making life difficult for everyone. The woman had a gift for appearing concerned and overwhelmed rather than malicious, sighing deeply as she explained how hard she was trying to help Emma adjust to life without her father. She would shake her head sadly and mention how Emma seemed determined to reject every kindness offered, making it clear that she was the victim in this situation. Emma's attempts to reach out were systematically undermined. When she tried to tell her aunt about the conditions at home, Janet had already prepared the ground by calling first to express concern about Emma's tendency toward exaggeration and attention-seeking behavior. When Emma approached a teacher, that same teacher had already heard from Janet about the girl's difficulties with truthfulness and her tendency to blame others for problems she created herself. Each failed attempt to get help only deepened Emma's despair and convinced her that no one would ever believe her word against Janet's carefully constructed facade. The physical evidence of abuse was always explained away or hidden. Bruises became results of Emma's clumsiness or propensity for getting into fights at school. Her poor hygiene was attributed to teenage rebellion and a refusal to take care of herself, despite Janet's patient guidance. The basement living conditions were described as a natural consequence for a girl who couldn't be trusted to respect the family's main living spaces. Summer stretched endlessly with Emma trapped on the property, while her stepsisters enjoyed swimming lessons and sleepovers with friends. Janet had convinced the school district that Emma needed structure and supervision during the break, making her too dangerous to participate in normal teenage activities. The girl spent her days doing manual labor around the property, cleaning animal pens, hauling feed, mending fences under the scorching sun, while Janet relaxed in air-conditioned comfort. The work was backbreaking for someone Emma's size, especially on the minimal food Janet provided. Breakfast consisted of whatever scraps remained after the family finished eating, usually cold oatmeal or stale bread. Lunch was often skipped entirely, with Janet claiming Emma needed to learn the value of hard work before earning the privilege of regular meals. Dinner was served after everyone else had eaten, typically consisting of whatever remained in the pots, sometimes just vegetables that had gone slightly bad or meat that was beginning to turn. Emma's clothes had deteriorated to rags that Janet refused to replace, claiming the girl destroyed everything given to her through carelessness and ingratitude. The few garments she possessed were stained, torn, and often didn't fit properly, having been purchased when she was younger and smaller. Janet would examine Emma's appearance each morning and make cutting comments about her inability to present herself properly, as if the girl had any control over her circumstances. The psychological warfare was constant and calculated. Janet would describe elaborate meals while Emma worked hungry in the heat, talking about restaurants she planned to visit with her daughters and friends Emma would never be allowed to meet. She would discuss shopping trips for school clothes that Emma wouldn't be receiving, vacation plans that didn't include her stepdaughter, and college funds that were being saved for her biological children alone. Sleep became Emma's only escape, but even that was frequently interrupted. Janet would bang on the basement door at random hours, claiming to hear noises or suspicious activity that required investigation. These midnight inspections were clearly designed to prevent Emma from getting adequate rest, leaving her exhausted and disoriented during the day when she needed energy for the demanding physical labor Janet assigned. The girl began to withdraw completely into herself, speaking only when directly questioned and keeping her eyes downcast to avoid provoking Janet's anger. She moved through her days like a sleepwalker, completing tasks mechanically while her mind retreated to memories of happier times with her father. Those memories were becoming harder to access, though, as if the constant stress and abuse were erasing the person she used to be and replacing her with someone hollow and afraid. August brought no relief from the oppressive heat or Janet's escalating cruelty. Emma's 17th birthday passed without acknowledgement, just another day of backbreaking labor and systematic humiliation. Janet seemed to take particular pleasure in scheduling the most degrading tasks for that day, as if punishing Emma for having the audacity to age another year in her household. The girl spent her birthday mucking out pig pens, while her stepsisters enjoyed a shopping trip to purchase new clothes for the approaching school year. The neighboring properties had begun to take notice of the strange girl who appeared occasionally in their fields, always working alone and looking increasingly haggard. Most dismissed their concerns, accepting Janet's explanations about a troubled teenager who needed firm guidance to overcome her behavioral problems. The Walsh family had lived in the community for generations, and Janet's reputation as a respectable church-going widow carried more weight than any gossip about her stepdaughter's treatment. Thomas Mackenzie owned the ranch adjacent to Janet's property, a sprawling operation that had been in his family for 4 generations. At 42, he was a quiet man who kept to himself following his divorce 3 years earlier. His ex-wife had moved back east with their 2 children, leaving Thomas alone with his cattle, horses, and the handful of workers who helped maintain the extensive property. He had noticed the girl working in brutal conditions next door, but hadn't interfered, assuming family discipline was none of his business. Everything changed on a scorching afternoon when Thomas was repairing fence line that bordered Janet's property. Emma was struggling to carry water buckets that were clearly too heavy for her diminished frame, stopping frequently to rest as sweat poured down her face. She stumbled and fell, spilling the water she had worked so hard to transport, and immediately began crying in a way that spoke to deeper despair than simple frustration with spilled water. Thomas found himself walking toward the property line before he consciously decided to intervene. Emma saw him approaching and panicked, trying to clean up the spilled water while apologizing repeatedly to no one in particular. Her fear was so intense that she seemed to forget he was a stranger rather than Janet, begging forgiveness for her clumsiness and promising to do better. The sight of this terrified girl groveling in the dirt over spilled water hit Thomas like a physical blow. He spoke softly, introducing himself and assuring Emma that accidents happen to everyone, that spilled water wasn't worth such distress. She looked at him with such surprise at hearing a kind voice that Thomas felt his heart break a little. When he offered to help her refill the buckets from his own well, which was much closer than her destination, Emma's gratitude was so overwhelming it made him uncomfortable. No child should be that thankful for basic human decency. Thomas's offer of help triggered a panic response in Emma that revealed just how thoroughly Janet had terrorized her. The girl's eyes darted frantically toward the house, calculating whether Janet might see her accepting assistance from a neighbor. Her hands shook as she explained in whispered fragments that she wasn't allowed to bother other people, that Janet had made it clear Emma's problems were her own responsibility, and that accepting help would only make things worse when Janet found out. The rancher found himself studying Emma more carefully, noting details that painted a disturbing picture. Her clothes were barely holding together, patched and repatched until they resembled fabric quilts more than actual garments. Her shoes had holes that had been stuffed with newspaper, and her hair hung in lank strings despite the obvious effort she'd made to keep it clean with limited resources. Most troubling were the careful movements she made, as if every gesture had been scrutinized and criticized until spontaneous action became impossible. Thomas insisted on helping despite Emma's protests, carrying the heavy buckets to wherever she needed them delivered. As they walked, he asked gentle questions about her situation, not pushing when she gave evasive answers, but nodding the fear that flickered across her face whenever Janet's name was mentioned. Emma seemed starved for normal human interaction, her responses gradually becoming less guarded as Thomas continued treating her like a person worthy of basic courtesy rather than a burden to be endured. When they reached the pig pen where Emma was expected to refill the water troughs, Thomas got his first real look at the conditions she was living in. The enclosure was filthy beyond anything acceptable for animal husbandry, and the smell alone was enough to make him gag. Emma moved through the space with practiced efficiency, clearly accustomed to working in conditions that would make most people sick. She apologized for the smell, as if she were personally responsible for the neglect that had created such deplorable circumstances. Janet's voice cut across the yard like a whip crack, demanding to know why Emma was bothering the neighbors instead of focusing on her assigned tasks. The transformation in Emma was immediate and heartbreaking. She shrank into herself, shoulders hunching defensively as her face went completely blank. Thomas watched this confident, kind girl disappear, replaced by a terrified child who radiated guilt and shame for the crime of accepting help with heavy lifting. The rancher introduced himself to Janet with careful politeness, explaining that he'd offered assistance when he noticed Emma struggling with the buckets. Janet's response was a masterclass in manipulation, her voice dripping with false concern as she apologized profusely for Emma's presumption in bothering him. She painted a picture of a troubled girl who took advantage of people's kindness, making Thomas the victim of Emma's manipulative behavior rather than a neighbor offering simple courtesy. Janet's performance was polished and convincing, honed through years of practice deflecting suspicion about Emma's treatment. She stood with perfect posture in a clean sundress, her hair styled and makeup applied, the picture of a respectable widow doing her best with difficult circumstances. Her voice carried just the right note of exhausted patience as she explained how hard she tried to teach Emma responsibility and self-reliance, sighing deeply about the challenges of raising someone else's child. Thomas found himself caught between his growing suspicions and the plausible explanations Janet provided for everything he'd observed. She had an answer for Emma's appearance. The girl refused to take care of her belongings and destroyed everything given to her through carelessness. She explained Emma's fear as typical teenage drama, the result of appropriate consequences for behavioral problems that outsiders couldn't understand without full context. Every concerning detail was reframed as evidence of Janet's saintly patience rather than potential abuse. Emma stood silent throughout this exchange, her eyes fixed on the ground as Janet described her various shortcomings and behavioral challenges. The girl's stillness was unnatural, the kind of frozen alertness that prey animals displayed when predators were near. Thomas noticed how Emma's breathing became shallow when Janet's hand settled on her shoulder in a gesture that appeared maternal, but caused the girl to flinch almost imperceptibly. The conversation concluded with Janet thanking Thomas profusely for his understanding and kindness, while firmly establishing that Emma's care and discipline were family matters that didn't require outside intervention. She promised to speak with Emma about bothering neighbors and assured Thomas that it wouldn't happen again. Her tone made it clear that Emma would face consequences for this interaction, regardless of who had initiated it. Thomas returned to his own property, deeply unsettled by what he'd witnessed, though he couldn't articulate exactly what felt wrong about the situation. Janet's explanations had been reasonable, her demeanor appropriate, and Emma had never directly contradicted anything her stepmother said. Yet something about the interaction left him feeling like he'd witnessed a carefully choreographed performance rather than a genuine family dynamic. Over the following days, Thomas found himself paying closer attention to the activities on Janet's property. He noticed that Emma worked alone regardless of weather conditions, that she never seemed to take breaks or receive visitors, and that her stepsisters appeared to live completely different lives with normal teenage freedoms and activities. The contrast was stark enough to be troubling, even accounting for the fact that Emma wasn't Janet's biological child. The consequences of Emma's interaction with Thomas were swift and severe. Janet waited until after dark to confront her stepdaughter, cornering Emma in the basement room while her own daughters slept peacefully upstairs. The woman's fury was cold and calculated, her voice barely above a whisper as she described exactly how disappointed she was in Emma's behavior and the embarrassment the girl had caused by appearing needy and pathetic to the neighbors. Janet's punishment was designed to ensure Emma would never again risk reaching out for help or accepting kindness from strangers. The girl's already meager food rations were cut further, with Janet explaining that someone who couldn't be trusted to represent the family properly didn't deserve the privilege of regular meals. Emma would earn her food through flawless behavior and absolute compliance with every rule and expectation. The basement room, already barely habitable, became even more restrictive. Janet removed the single chair Emma had been allowed to use, leaving only a mattress on the concrete floor and a bucket for personal needs. The small window that provided minimal natural light was covered with cardboard, plunging the space into perpetual darkness that made it impossible for Emma to maintain any sense of time or normalcy. Emma's work assignments became increasingly punitive, designed more to break her spirit than accomplish necessary tasks. She was required to scrub floors that Janet would inspect with white gloves, searching for microscopic imperfections that would justify hours of recleaning. The girl spent entire days moving rocks from one pile to another, only to be told the next morning that she'd done it wrong and needed to move them all back. The psychological component of the punishment was perhaps more damaging than the physical deprivation. Janet began a campaign of constant criticism and correction, finding fault with everything Emma did regardless of the quality of her work. The girl's posture was wrong, her breathing was too loud, her footsteps were disruptive, her very presence was an imposition on the family's peace and happiness. Sleep became nearly impossible as Janet implemented random midnight inspections, banging on the basement door and demanding that Emma recite lists of rules or explain her failures from the previous day. These sessions could last for hours, leaving Emma exhausted and disoriented when morning came, and the cycle of labor and humiliation began again. The girl began to lose weight at an alarming rate, her already thin frame becoming skeletal as stress and malnutrition took their toll. Emma's isolation became complete as Janet eliminated any remaining connections to the outside world. The girl was forbidden from making eye contact with neighbors, mailmen, or delivery drivers. She was required to hide whenever visitors came to the property, ensuring that no one else would witness her deteriorating condition or ask uncomfortable questions about her welfare. Thomas Mackenzie couldn't shake his growing unease about the situation next door. His brief interaction with Emma had left him with more questions than answers, and Janet's polished explanations felt increasingly hollow as he replayed the conversation in his mind. The girl's terror had been genuine and immediate, far beyond what would be expected from typical teenage embarrassment about being caught accepting help with chores. Professional obligations kept Thomas busy through most of August, but he found himself unconsciously timing his fence work and cattle checks to coincide with periods when he might catch glimpses of activity on Janet's property. What he observed troubled him deeply. Emma was always working alone, often in conditions that seemed dangerous for someone her size and apparent physical condition. She moved differently now, with a careful deliberation that suggested pain or injury. The rancher began asking subtle questions around town about the Walsh family, careful not to appear overly interested or suspicious. The responses he received painted Janet as a pillar of the community, a devoted church member who had taken on the difficult task of raising her late husband's troubled daughter. People spoke admiringly of her patience and dedication, though Thomas noticed that no one seemed to have much direct contact with Emma herself. Dr. Patricia Winters, who ran the local veterinary clinic, provided the most revealing insight during a routine visit to check Thomas's horses. She mentioned that Janet had requested advice about nutrition for teenage girls, claiming Emma had developed an eating disorder that was causing dramatic weight loss. The stepmother had seemed very concerned about Emma's refusal to eat properly, asking about supplements and meal replacement options that might tempt a girl who was clearly struggling with food-related behavioral issues. This conversation sent chills down Thomas's spine. In his brief interaction with Emma, the girl had appeared genuinely hungry rather than someone avoiding food by choice. Her desperate gratitude for simple kindness suggested someone who had been deprived of basic human decency, not a teenager acting out through self-starvation. Janet was already preparing explanations for Emma's deteriorating physical condition, setting the stage to blame the girl herself for any health problems that might draw unwanted attention. Thomas realized he was witnessing something far more sinister than strict parenting or blended family difficulties. Emma was being systematically destroyed by someone who had perfected the art of abuse while maintaining a flawless public image. The question was what, if anything, he could do about it without making Emma's situation even worse than it already was. The first week of September brought a brief respite from the summer heat, but no relief for Emma's increasingly desperate situation. Janet's campaign of psychological and physical abuse had intensified to the point where the girl was barely surviving from day to day. Her weight loss had become severe enough that her already ill-fitting clothes hung like sacks on her diminished frame, and her movements had slowed to those of someone much older and more frail. Thomas had been watching the situation with growing alarm, particularly after his conversation with Dr. Winters. He'd noticed that Emma no longer appeared in the yard during daylight hours. Her outdoor work apparently shifted to early morning or evening, when fewer people might observe her condition. The few glimpses he caught of her showed a girl who was clearly failing physically, moving with the careful deliberation of someone in constant pain. The breaking point came on a cool Thursday morning when Thomas was checking his cattle in the pasture that bordered Janet's property. Emma emerged from the house before dawn, clearly believing she was unobserved as she made her way to the pig pen to begin her morning tasks. The girl stumbled and fell halfway across the yard, then lay motionless on the ground for several minutes before struggling to get back to her feet. Thomas was already moving toward the fence line when Emma collapsed a second time, her legs simply giving out beneath her as she tried to carry buckets that were obviously too heavy for her weakened state. This time she didn't get up immediately, instead curling into a ball on the ground as if the effort of standing had become too much to manage. The sight of this broken girl lying in the dirt finally pushed Thomas past the point of polite non-interference. He vaulted the fence and crossed into Janet's yard without permission, reaching Emma just as she was attempting to pull herself upright using the fence post for support. Up close, her condition was even more alarming than he'd realized. Her skin had a grayish pallor that spoke to serious malnutrition, and her eyes were sunken deep in her skull. She weighed almost nothing when he helped her to her feet, her bones clearly visible beneath skin that seemed stretched too tight. Emma's first instinct was to apologize frantically for bothering him again, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to explain that she was fine, just tired, and that Janet would be very upset if she knew Emma had caused problems for the neighbors. The girl's panic at the thought of Janet discovering this interaction was so intense that she began hyperventilating, begging Thomas to please forget he'd seen her and go back to his own property before anyone noticed. The rancher found himself faced with a decision that would change multiple lives forever. He could walk away, tell himself that family situations were complicated and not his responsibility, and hope that someone with more authority would eventually intervene. Or he could acknowledge what his eyes and heart were telling him, that Emma was being slowly murdered by someone who had perfected the art of making abuse look like appropriate discipline. Thomas Mackenzie had always been a man who acted on his principles rather than his fears, and watching Emma struggle to remain upright while apologizing for existing finally crystallized his resolve. The girl was dying in plain sight while an entire community looked the other way, convinced by Janet's carefully crafted narrative that this was simply a case of appropriate discipline for a troubled teenager. Someone needed to intervene before it was too late, and Thomas realized that someone was going to have to be him. He helped Emma steady herself against the fence post while speaking in the calm, gentle voice he used with frightened animals. The girl's terror was palpable as she kept glancing toward the house, calculating how long she had before Janet discovered she wasn't working. Her hands shook constantly now, not just from fear, but from the physical effects of prolonged malnutrition and stress. Thomas could see that she was rapidly approaching the point where her body would simply shut down from the abuse it had endured. Emma begged him to leave before Janet woke up, her voice barely above a whisper as she described the consequences she would face for this second interaction with a neighbor. The girl's fear was so intense that she seemed more afraid of Janet discovering their conversation than she was of the obvious medical emergency she was experiencing. She tried to lift the water buckets again, determined to complete her assigned tasks regardless of her physical condition. Thomas made a decision that felt inevitable and terrifying at the same time. He told Emma quietly that she was coming with him, that whatever Janet had threatened would happen if Emma accepted help couldn't be worse than what was already happening to her every day. The girl's immediate response was panic so pure and intense that she began hyperventilating, convinced that running away would somehow make everything worse rather than better. The rancher had to use every technique he'd learned for calming spooked horses to help Emma regulate her breathing and heart rate. He spoke continuously in low, reassuring tones while helping her understand that she wasn't in trouble, that he wasn't angry with her, and that sometimes accepting help was the bravest thing a person could do. Gradually, Emma's panic subsided enough for her to listen to what Thomas was actually saying rather than what her traumatized mind expected to hear. When Janet's voice called from the house, demanding to know why Emma wasn't at her assigned tasks yet, the girl's terror returned full force. Thomas found himself standing between Emma and the source of her fear, his own protective instincts fully engaged as he realized this moment would determine whether Emma lived or died. Janet appeared on the porch in her bathrobe, her face contorting with rage as she realized her stepdaughter was once again interacting with the neighbor who had already caused problems. The confrontation that followed would be remembered by both participants for the rest of their lives, though their versions of events would differ dramatically. Thomas would remember standing his ground against a woman whose mask of respectability finally slipped to reveal the monster underneath. Janet would remember an interfering neighbor who destroyed her family through lies and manipulation, refusing to understand the challenges of raising someone else's difficult child. Janet's fury at discovering Emma with Thomas again was immediate and explosive, though she tried to maintain her facade of concerned stepmother even as her voice shook with barely controlled rage. She demanded to know why Emma was bothering the neighbors instead of completing her assigned chores, her tone suggesting that this was a pattern of manipulative behavior rather than a cry for help from a girl who was clearly in medical distress. Thomas found himself studying Janet with new eyes, seeing past the carefully maintained appearance to the calculation behind every word and gesture. The woman's concern was performative, designed to position herself as the long-suffering victim of Emma's behavioral problems, rather than someone who might bear responsibility for the girl's obvious physical deterioration. Every sentence was crafted to deflect blame while painting Emma as ungrateful and manipulative. Emma's response to Janet's appearance was heartbreaking in its intensity. The girl immediately began apologizing in a stream of words so rapid they were barely comprehensible, taking full responsibility for bothering Thomas and promising it would never happen again. Her terror was so profound that she seemed to forget Thomas was present, focusing entirely on Janet's reaction and the consequences she knew would follow this interaction. The rancher realized he was witnessing the dynamic that had allowed Emma's abuse to continue undetected for so long. Janet's public persona was so convincing, and Emma's conditioning so complete, that outside observers would naturally assume the stepmother was dealing appropriately with a troubled child. The girl's trained responses reinforced every negative assumption about her character while protecting Janet from any serious scrutiny. Thomas made a conscious decision to stop playing by Janet's rules and social conventions that had enabled Emma's suffering to continue. He stated clearly and calmly that he was concerned about Emma's physical condition and believed she needed immediate medical attention. His words were measured and professional, impossible to dismiss as neighborhood gossip or misunderstanding, and they represented the first time anyone had directly challenged Janet's narrative about Emma's situation. Janet's reaction revealed the depth of her investment in maintaining control over Emma and the narrative surrounding their relationship. She launched into a detailed explanation of Emma's supposed eating disorder and behavioral problems, painting a picture of a girl who was determined to destroy herself, despite her stepmother's patient efforts to help. Every symptom of abuse was reframed as evidence of Emma's mental instability and self-destructive tendencies. The conversation reached a crescendo when Thomas stated flatly that regardless of Emma's supposed behavioral issues, she was clearly in need of medical care and proper nutrition. He offered to drive Emma to the hospital himself, an offer that Janet rejected with increasing desperation as she realized her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Emma watched this exchange in silent terror, caught between her conditioned fear of Janet and a growing hope that someone might finally intervene on her behalf. The standoff between Thomas and Janet created a moment of suspended tension, where Emma's future hung in the balance. Janet's desperation was becoming more apparent as she realized that her carefully crafted explanations weren't having their usual effect on this particular neighbor. Thomas remained calm but immovable, his rancher's instincts telling him that backing down now would seal Emma's fate and potentially cost the girl her life. Emma herself seemed frozen between two impossible choices: the known horror of remaining with Janet, or the terrifying unknown of trusting a relative stranger who claimed he wanted to help. Her conditioning ran so deep that accepting help felt like betraying Janet, even though that same person had systematically destroyed her life over the past 3 years. The girl's confusion was visible as she struggled to process the concept that someone might genuinely care about her welfare. Janet's mask began to slip more noticeably as her usual tactics failed to work on Thomas. Her voice took on a harder edge as she demanded to know what right he had to interfere in private family matters, threatening to call the police if he didn't return to his own property immediately. The woman's transformation from concerned stepmother to aggressive defender of her territory revealed glimpses of the person Emma lived with behind closed doors. Thomas recognized the moment when reasonable conversation ended and a more fundamental battle began. He told Janet clearly that he would be happy to have the police involved, that he welcomed any official investigation into Emma's living conditions and physical state. His calm acceptance of official scrutiny clearly hadn't been part of Janet's calculations, and her increasing agitation suggested she had reasons to avoid law enforcement attention. The rancher's offer to involve authorities created a new dynamic in the confrontation. Emma's terror intensified as she imagined the consequences of police involvement, having been conditioned to believe that any official attention would somehow be her fault and result in even worse treatment. Janet's desperation became more obvious as she realized her threats weren't having their intended effect on someone who seemed genuinely willing to face whatever consequences might come from interfering. Thomas found himself thinking about his own children, living safely with their mother hundreds of miles away, and how he would want someone to intervene if they were ever in Emma's situation. The girl reminded him of a horse he'd once rescued from neglectful owners, so broken by abuse that kindness felt like another form of cruelty, so conditioned to expect the worst that hope had become more frightening than despair. The moment of decision arrived when Emma swayed on her feet again, her weakened body unable to maintain the stress position she'd adopted, while Janet berated her. Thomas stepped forward instinctively to steady her, and the simple human gesture of support seemed to break something loose in the girl's carefully controlled composure. For the first time since he'd known her, Emma looked directly at him with an expression that held more hope than fear. Emma's moment of eye contact with Thomas created a shift in the dynamic that Janet immediately recognized as dangerous. The woman's voice sharpened as she ordered Emma to get back to her chores and stop causing problems for everyone around her. But something had changed in the girl's posture, a tiny spark of defiance that suggested Thomas's intervention might have given her the first glimpse of an alternative to her current existence. Thomas seized on that moment of connection, speaking directly to Emma rather than about her to Janet. He told the girl that she had choices, that no one deserved to live in fear and hunger, and that accepting help wasn't shameful or wrong. His words were simple but revolutionary for someone who had been systematically taught that her suffering was not only deserved, but necessary for the family's stability and peace. Janet's desperation reached a crescendo as she realized she was losing control of the narrative that had protected her abuse for years. She launched into a furious tirade about ungrateful children and interfering neighbors, her carefully maintained facade crumbling to reveal the bitter, angry woman underneath. The performance was no longer calculated for maximum effect. It was raw emotion driven by the fear of losing her primary target for abuse and control. Emma watched this breakdown with fascination and terror, seeing Janet's true nature revealed in ways she'd only experienced in private before. The girl's understanding of her situation began to shift as she realized that Janet's behavior wasn't normal parental discipline, but something darker and more pathological. Thomas's presence had created a space where Emma could observe rather than simply endure, and that observation was changing everything. The rancher found himself face to face with pure malevolence disguised as respectability, and the experience was more chilling than anything he'd encountered in his rural life. Janet's anger, when thwarted, revealed someone who viewed Emma not as a person but as property, whose value lay primarily in her availability as a target for abuse. The woman's sense of ownership over Emma was absolute, and she clearly viewed any interference as theft of something that belonged to her. Thomas realized that conventional approaches to this situation would likely fail, that Janet's skill at manipulation and Emma's conditioned responses would allow the abuse to continue even if temporary interventions occurred. The girl needed more than rescue. She needed complete removal from Janet's influence and time to heal from trauma that had shaped her entire understanding of human relationships. The decision he made in that moment would expose him to legal consequences and social judgment, but Thomas found he cared less about those risks than about Emma's survival. He told the girl clearly that she could come with him right now, that she didn't need Janet's permission to leave, and that there were people in the world who would help her without expecting payment in the form of suffering and humiliation. Emma's response to Thomas's offer of immediate help was complex and heartbreaking, revealing the depth of psychological damage Janet had inflicted over 3 years of systematic abuse. The girl's first instinct was to look to Janet for permission. So thoroughly conditioned was she to seek approval for every action, even those that might save her life. Her inability to conceive of making independent decisions showed how completely her sense of personal agency had been destroyed. Thomas recognized the signs of someone whose will had been systematically broken, and he adjusted his approach accordingly. Instead of waiting for Emma to make a decision she'd been trained never to make, he began moving toward his truck while talking continuously in the same calm voice he used with traumatized animals. He explained that he was going to drive her to get medical attention, that she wasn't in trouble, and that sometimes other people had to make difficult decisions when someone was too sick to make them independently. Janet's final desperate attempt to maintain control revealed the depths of her narcissistic investment in Emma's suffering. She threatened to call the police and report Thomas for kidnapping, to tell everyone in town that he was interfering with a family's private business, and to ensure that Emma faced severe consequences for this betrayal when she inevitably returned home. Her threats were designed to convince both Thomas and Emma that resistance was futile and would only make everything worse. The rancher's response was to continue loading Emma into his truck, while calmly informing Janet that she was welcome to call anyone she wanted, that he looked forward to official investigations of Emma's living conditions, and that sometimes doing the right thing required accepting whatever consequences might follow. His steady confidence in the face of Janet's threats seemed to give Emma permission to stop trying to manage.